Hey guys, this is MugenLord here, and today I just want to talk about Final Fantasy as a series, as a whole, because lately we've been talking about it quite a few times here on this channel, and especially recently we talked about Final Fantasy 16 and how Japanese consumers and fans of the Final Fantasy series are really scared of how whether or not they will be able to have access to Final Fantasy 16. For the simple fact is now Sony had decided to increase the price of the console in Japan and also the availability of the console. Many people still can't get their hands on PS5 altogether, so how else they'll be able to play it? And because of the exclusive deal that Square Enix have with Sony and the console itself, this timed exclusive I really never agree with in the first place, but a lot of fans simply can't afford it or simply can't get their hands on it and would love Sony to be able to move Final Fantasy 16 on other platforms for fans to get their hands on it. And I want to continue the conversation is for the fact is that Yoshi P, the mastermind behind Final Fantasy 14, and everybody is really banking a lot of their hopes on Final Fantasy 16 since he's also the producer behind that as well. He had pretty much had an interview talking about the current state of Final Fantasy and how Square Enix is still struggling with the series as a whole as far as adapting the series to current generation. So we're gonna get right into it. I think it's an interesting discussion to have as far as Final Fantasy is concerned, because it's something I've always been thinking about as well. Now, when it comes to Final Fantasy, I've pretty much fallen in and out of love with Final Fantasy. For the simple fact is, we are in year 2022. We are only on the 16th entry of Final Fantasy. You would think that we probably should have been by this time on the 18th or maybe the 20th entry of Final Fantasy, but Square Enix has been struggling with the series and struggling with the development of the series for a very long time, and we have seen that trouble when they first announced Final Fantasy 13, which was something a game I've been looking forward to since it's been announced early as I believe E3 of 2006, and it was coming to the PS3, and then since then we have seen nothing of it. And by the time Final Fantasy 13 had released, it didn't live up to the expectations in all the years I've been waiting for it on the PS3, and it was pretty much a letdown. And I know that because of Final Fantasy 13 have pretty much introduced many different new fans to the series, and kudos to that we have new fans of the series, but that was at the point where, for me, I would say is when Final Fantasy had pretty much has fallen downhill. I started falling away from it, falling out of love with Final Fantasy. Some would say that Final Fantasy 12 was the thing because that was during the time Final Fantasy and many of the developers were experimenting with the series as far as its combat system is concerned and the overall aspects. And then even some would say Final Fantasy X may be the thing or the factor where the change actually started kicking in. You know, the loss of an overworld, a world map, and the experience point system pretty much removing changes of a sphere grid. So many people can argue when Final Fantasy started to take a dip or change, some would say for the worse, but for me it was Final Fantasy 13, and since then I pretty much fell out of it when it came to Final Fantasy. And despite Final Fantasy 14 being a good game, I really don't count that, as that console traditional Final Fantasy game. It's an MMO. It's in its own genre, which I love Final Fantasy 14, so don't get that wrong, and I will talk about that in a totally different video. But when we finally got a chance to actually see a new entry into the Final Fantasy series on console, which was Final Fantasy 15, I was most certainly disappointed in it. I wasn't really happy with it, and I bought the game day one when it launched, and I haven't really got past the intro of the game because it just didn't feel like Final Fantasy to me. Everything wrong with it just didn't gel right. It just didn't feel right to me, and it didn't feel like a traditional Final Fantasy game. Now, despite the combat system, and I was open arms for the combat system, even though I'm more of a turn-based guy, I was still willing to give it a chance, but everything about it just didn't feel Final Fantasy. And then the fact is that they had broken it up in some of the main story elements into DLC, and it just felt like they were just milking this fan base with that game. And the fact is that Tetsuya Nomura was the head of that, and after playing Kingdom Hearts, you can kind of see that maybe Tetsuya Nomura shouldn't be in charge of some Final Fantasy projects. I would just say that's my opinion. But now we fast forward, and now we have Final Fantasy 16, and Final Fantasy 16 is something that I most certainly was super excited for, because we finally get a new entry into the Final Fantasy series for the consoles, and this is something that I really want to get my hands on and actually play. We finally moving forward. We no longer going backwards. We no longer doing remakes. We no longer remastering. We actually moving the series forward, and it was exciting to see that Final Fantasy was returning back to its roots. We going back to that fantasy, that high fantasy, which Final Fantasy haven't done in a really, really long time. And so it was good to see that until, we actually got to start to see some gameplay. And I noticed that, Final Fantasy is no longer doing the turn-based no more. That's something they just don't want to do. And like I said, I was like, okay, I can deal with that, because after playing Final Fantasy VII Remake, I believe Square Enix had done a good job as far as the combat is concerned. It catered to both audiences, in my opinion. It still had that turn-based feel to it. It still had that strategy feel to it, where you still had to think and plot out your moves, and you had to give commands out to your party members. So the combat was pretty addictive when it came to Final Fantasy VII Remake. So when Final Fantasy 16 showed that it will be doing something much similar or aching to what we saw with Final Fantasy VII Remake, I said, okay, I can deal with that. But it wasn't until later where we start to see more of this gameplay. And from the earlier trailers, it didn't show other party members in Final Fantasy 16. So I started getting afraid. It's because let's say, okay, this is another Final Fantasy game that may be experimenting once more to try something different once again, instead of just returning back to formula. And it seemed as though that from the teaser or from the trailer that we had earlier is that Final Fantasy 16 was going to be a one-man party. And then eventually, a few months ago, we finally actually got a chance to see a brand new trailer, and exactly what it is: a one-man party JRPG that focuses heavily on combat. And you can tell from the combat itself that they got the director from Dead or Alive and also from the Dragon Dogma series to actually work on the combat. And it started to feel like that Final Fantasy is no longer Final Fantasy, in my opinion. From a fan who has always been playing Final Fantasy games, it's starting to cater to more of this generation, that high action in your face combat system, and it starts to pretty much loses its flair, or loses its what makes it Final Fantasy, So in this article that I have pretty much read into, and it was trending on Twitter, Yoshi P wanted to give his opinion on what he believed the current state and what Final Fantasy is currently struggling with. So I posted quotes here from Nomura himself when he pretty much asked Yoshi P, despite his enthusiasm for the bright future of Final Fantasy XIV, Yoshida is characteristically candid about the series as a whole. So we won't get into it. So, quote, "In terms of whether Final Fantasy is successfully adapting to industry trends, I believe the series is currently struggling. We're not at a point where we receive a wide variety of requests regarding the direction of our game design. To be honest, it would be impossible to satisfy all those requests with a single title. My current impression is that all we can do is create multiple games and continue creating the best that we can at any given time." And that's the thing. And the problem is, when it comes to Final Fantasy, Square Enix has this thing to where, which Yoshi P also said to himself, is that they're supposed to be creating trends. And Yoshida says right here is that Final Fantasy has never been about chasing trends, but setting them. So the thing was, with Yoshi P, what I agree is, Square Enix in the past has been just whatever the new trend was, as far as action games, first-person shooters, or anything, I would say, the Western market, which Square Enix, in my opinion, to me, is still chasing that Western dollar or Western trends. And it seemed like that every Final Fantasy, that current Final Fantasy that tends to come out, tends to try to follow those trends, and then they don't understand what that trend has done that made it popular to begin with, and they experiment with it, and then it doesn't bode well. And Final Fantasy 15 was that game that essentially had really done it for me. Like, I don't know, I don't think Final Fantasy may be for me anymore. But Final Fantasy 16 wants to try something different, and they said that Final Fantasy 16 wants to be that game that set new trends, something that Square Enix has typically done in the past. They create trends and other companies follow those trends to create other things, or inspired by Square Enix to create newer experiences moving forward. So I would say this: Final Fantasy 16 may not appeal to me as far as how the combat is, but I won't say I wouldn't give the game a try. I'm cautiously optimistic because I have faith in Yoshi P himself, and what he have done with Final Fantasy 14, and everybody tend to love what this guy has been capable of and what he's able to do with the game. So I definitely want to keep my eyes open to see what he does, and follow the many different trailers that we have yet to experience, because he has a whole lot more to show us. And it may change my mind, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm starting to realize more and more that Final Fantasy will be the type of series that's going to often continue to evolve, and it will never be the series that I've grown up to love. And I know people say that a franchise has to change at some point or another, and that is true. But in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with keeping things in trademarks and things that made the series what it was, but expound upon it, improve upon it to make it appeal to the mainstream or to modern gameplay conventions, opposed to just dumping it all out and just create something completely different to the point it's unrecognizable. And I think that's the problem that I have with Final Fantasy. But as I get older, I'm starting to realize that even when it comes to gaming and comes to some of my favorite franchises, I'm starting to just acknowledge and just willing to now just say, you know what, and concede and just say that, hey, this series may no longer be for me anymore. It's just not meant for me anymore. It's just meant for a newer audience, and I'm not the target audience anymore like it used to be in the past. And it is a bummer, but as I said before, it's Yoshi P, and I'm going to keep an eye out for Final Fantasy 16. But I definitely want to hear your thoughts in the comment sections below. What do you think about Final Fantasy as a whole? Do you think they're struggling, or do you think that Final Fantasy 16 is going to be the game that actually bring Final Fantasy back up to prominence? That when you see the Final Fantasy name, that you know you're in for a treat, you know you're in for quality and everything. So definitely your thoughts in the comment sections below. And which Final Fantasy title that you love? Which one is your favorite? And including the spin-offs as well. So if you like the video, hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and also hit that bell to be notified for more RPG news in the future. This is MugenLord, signing off. I'll see you Game Fiends later. Peace out.